What's wrong with you people?
Welcome to Not Another Baptist Podcast. My name is Kyle Bierman. Matt Hensley is off finishing up a mission trip in Puerto Rico right now. And so if you've been following him on social media at all, you'll see some of the great stories that have come out of that. So continue to be in prayer for him as they finish up there and head back this weekend. We are grateful for he and of course his association of churches that are serving well alongside the Send Relief Center there in Puerto Rico. So today we are not joined by Matt, but we have a special guest that if you have listened to the new Revitalize and Replant podcast with Mark Clifton, you will know as the voice, as the host. But today we're joined by a guy named Dan Hurst. Dan is, but before I met you, I told a lot of people that Mark Clifton was the most interesting man that I had ever met. And now that has been surpassed.
No, that's actually, that could be a condemnation.
But you know, the old, I think it was a beer commercial, but you know, the most interesting man in the world commercials. Yeah. So I've decided you are at the least the most interesting Baptist in the world. Dan Hurst, welcome to Not Another Baptist Podcast. Introduce yourself to our listeners who maybe haven't heard the Revitalize and Replant podcast. Tell us who you are, what you do, about your family.
Well, my name is Dan Hurst, and I am really, my world has changed somewhat in these last few years of my life. I spend my life doing commercials and narrations and movie trailers and promos for networks and stuff like that. And I have a studio in my house. In fact, I'm sitting in my studio right now. And this is what I do. And I do this to support myself so that I can do what I really love. And that's what I feel God's called me to do. And that is to serve in ministry in whichever way and whatever door that he opens up for me. And it all began on the mission field. My parents were missionaries. And I grew up in Honduras speaking Spanish. Spanish is my first language. And from there, it just kind of blossomed. And when I was 13 years old, there was a conservative Baptist mission team in Honduras that had a radio station. And I was really interested in that. And so we were all the missionaries in Honduras were all aunts and uncles. We were all family. And so Uncle David Jones, who was the conservative Baptist missionary there, said, would you like to come and learn how to work in radio? And I said, sure. So I went in and hung around and they trained me. And eventually they gave me my first job in radio, which was playing Christmas music for the missionaries. It was a shortwave radio station. And so missionaries all over Central America could pick up the station, and they wanted me to play Christmas music. And so for the holidays, that's how I got started playing Christmas music. My first day on the job, they forgot to give me a key to the radio station. So when I got there at whatever time it was, 5:00 in the morning, whatever it was, and I got there and I had to shimmy up a pole and break in on the second floor. And that's how my career started. That should have been an omen right there. But, that's where it all started. And I started eventually wound up in radio. But I was in the pastorate, served in the pastorate for a number of years. And from that, felt like God was calling me to work with churches at risk. And there's no other way to explain it other than it really was a calling. And I can remember spending time talking to some of the people that I trusted the most about it. Is this the right thing to do? Because if I work with churches at risk, they're not going to be able to afford to pay me a salary that I can support a wife and 3 boys on. And so I knew I was going to have to get my own job and essentially be bivocational. And, every one of those guys that I talked to all said, you know what, if we had to do it over again, that's exactly what we would do. And it was such an affirmation. And so I left First Baptist Church of Tequesta, Florida, and came back to the Kansas City area. My wife was actually from Liberty, which is a suburb of Kansas City, and started working with churches at risk, and have been working in that capacity of one way or another for many, many years. But through that, I had to get a job, and I got a job in radio because my degree was in broadcast journalism. before I went to seminary, and so I decided to use that as my support. And I did that and worked with churches and did that. Did a morning show here in Kansas City for almost 20 years. It did real well. It was a very successful show, and one of those. I knew that the time was coming when radio was eventually not going to be able to continue with the way it was going, and it was written on the wall that our days were numbered. And so, sure enough, one day they called us all in and fired us all, and said they were going in a different direction, which of course meant that we were going in a different direction. And I'd already started building up my voiceover business a little bit, knowing that that day was coming. And so that day I came back to this studio, as a matter of fact, and I called all the clients that I had started developing, and I said, well, I'm in this full time now. And the next day I worked 8 hours and been working at that load ever since.
Wow. Now so if you're listening to this and you're hearing Dan's voice, chances are you've heard it somewhere before, right? I know you said you've done a lot of stuff for McDonald's. You've done voiceover trailers. I was watching a baseball game the other day, and there was a Ford commercial. Are you the Ford is the best in Texas
Yeah.
guy? Okay.
That's me.
When I heard that, I was like, I think that's Dan. So talk to us a little bit about, because you did all those things, but you also had this other gig that you did for about 15 years there in Kansas City. And Matt and I are both huge baseball fans. And so as far as I'm concerned, like, this is probably one of the coolest jobs on the planet.
Yeah.
And so tell our listeners what you did for 15 years there.
Well, I had started full time with a station called KLSI, which eventually became Mix 93, and bought another station called KUDL, and that was my career essentially in radio, was between those three stations. And when I first started full time with them, the engineer came to me one day. This was I think my first week, and he said, "Hey," he said, "the Royals are looking for a new stadium announcer. Would you be interested?" And I went, "Well, yeah, who wouldn't be interested in something like that?" I didn't have any experience doing it, but I thought, how do nobody does. I mean, how do you get experience doing that? So I said, "Sure." He said, "Well, we'll put an audition tape together." And I said, "What do you do for an audition tape for that?" And he said, "Oh, just pretend you're calling somebody into bat or whatever." And so I went, "Oh, okay." So I went into the little studio there at the station that morning, and I recorded a few things, now batting and just some different things like that. And I sent it off to him, and I thought, the engineer said, "I'll take it to him." He was going out there. And I thought, well, I might hear from them. If I do hear from them, it'd probably be, a week or two. And you know how that goes, because hundreds of people apply for those jobs, obviously. So they would spend time going through all of those tapes. And so I got a call that afternoon, and they said, "Would you like to come in and do a live audition?" And I went,
Wow.
"Sure." So I went in the next day and did the live audition. And about a week
Now, is that
later,
like over the stadium PA? Is that what the live audition is? Oh, man.
Yeah. And that was nerve-wracking because, the sound comes back at you in a delay, and you have to learn how to adjust to that. But so there I was auditioning, doing that. And a little while later, they told me I had the job, which was awesome. And so this was in March. And of course, the season started right at the beginning of April. In fact, I think it was April the 4th was the first game, I think. And so I spent a lot of time just cramming and learning and going over notes and scripts and all kinds of stuff like that, and practicing. And I'll never forget going out there, and I would have the whole stadium to myself. Essentially, I'd be up in the booth, which was right behind home plate, the best seat in the house, and I would be practicing these things, and it would be going out over the the speaker system in the whole stadium, which must have been really nerve-wracking for everybody that was working there. But anyway, that was the way it was, and that's what they wanted me to do. And one day I had a script, and I was practicing doing the national anthem, having people stand for the national anthem, that sort of thing. And George Toma, who was the groundskeeper, was down on the field, and he was working on something and on the tractor. And I just was practicing, and telling the people to stand. It's time for the national anthem, and yada, yada, take your hats off, cover your heart with your ball cap and stuff like that. And then we were actually going to play. We had a recorded version of the national anthem, and George Thomas stopped his tractor, got off, and stood at attention for the whole national anthem. I thought that was the coolest thing, and I thought, I am home. I love this. This is great people to work with. And George was like that. He was a bit of a goofball, but he was a very patriotic goofball. But anyway, my first game was that a few weeks later, and
wow.
And started doing that for the next 14, 15 years.
Wow. So as you're doing that, you're also pastoring a church, and you have the #1 morning show in Kansas City. Dan, that's a lot.
Yeah, that's what my wife said. She kept saying, this is a lot. You got to let something go. And,
so,
what do you...
Yeah. So as somebody who's been a bivocational, trivocational pastor, I think I wrote a blog post not too long ago talking about the coming reality in revitalization. That is that I think bivocational, co-vocational ministries are going to become the norm. We're going to see more and more of those pop up, just as you have more and more smaller churches as inflation continues to hit. I think there's going to be a lot more churches that are going to that either out of necessity, maybe some even strategically. And so what were some of the principles that you learned as you're pastoring a church and then working another full-time job? And then, the baseball season, on the days when they're in town, that's almost a full-time job as well. So what did you learn about balancing ministry and other, vocational responsibilities during those years?
Well, I saw all of it as a ministry, for one thing. I saw what I did at the ballpark as opportunities for ministry. Obviously, the radio station was an opportunity for ministry. We spent a lot of time on the air. I didn't hold back from my faith. I tried to be sensitive to people who wouldn't agree with me, but I think I made it very clear that I was a believer.
And just so our listeners know, you were not in a Christian radio station either.
No, this was a soft rock station, and KUDL, Cuddle, and it was 98.1. KUDL was the station, and it was an historic station, a legendary station. It had been around for years and years and years. And so, it was very much a soft rock station, and it was the kind of station that adults listened to. And I talked about my faith. I talked about going to church. I talked about, things that happened in church, things that happened to people in church. So everything to me was, the ministry was all of that was just a tapestry, if you will, of ministry. But the one thing that I really discovered, and I agree with you, by the way, on the coming change, for pastors and churches. I think we'll always have some full-time pastors, no question about that. But I think the trend is going to be bivocationalism, which I like. And I'll tell you one of the things that I loved about it, still do, and that is I feel a greater connection to my people that way, because they're working stiffs. And I know what the pressure's like. I know what that's like to have to balance all of that and to be so dog tired at the end of the day that what do? Your kids want to play with you, or your wife wants to go out to eat, or you've got friends that want to get together. What do you do? How do you balance all of that? And it's a stretch. It's difficult, and you have to be so organized, I believe, so focused, where your calendar becomes your best friend, and everything. I've started learning to write everything on my calendar. Back in those days, it was a day timer. Now, you've got an iPhone, you can do it on that. But back in those days, I carried a pocket calendar, and I wrote everything. If there was something I needed to do, I put it on the calendar. And whether it was visiting somebody in the hospital, or finding time to prepare a message, or answering business calls, things like that, all of that went into a calendar. And I found myself so liberated by that, because if it wasn't on the calendar, then I probably didn't have to worry about it, and I didn't. And so I followed my calendar, and I followed that schedule. And that really kept me sane, I believe. And it also helped my wife know what my day was going to be like, or what my weekend was going to be like.
Yeah. So now, in addition to voiceover work and And by the way, like I said, you're gonna, if now that you kind of know Dan's voice, you'll hear him around. Earlier this year, I know you really don't like talking about this, but it is a big deal. You won the equivalent of the Oscar for voiceover work for movie trailers
Yeah.
for the HBO Max miniseries Winning Time.
Yeah.
And man, so I mean that's a huge deal. Congratulations! And now to
Thank you.
top it all off, at the pinnacle of your career, you've got this brand new podcast with Mark Clifton and Mark Halleck. So, I mean, obviously, you've reached the top. There's
Yeah.
nowhere else to go
Nowhere
from
else to
here.
go. It's time to retire. Yeah.
Um,
That was
so
such a treat because Mark and I have been friends for almost 50 years. We've known each other. His dad and my dad were roommates in college, and his mom and my mom, they all of there was about 5 men and their soon to be wives who hung out together at William Jewell, and they all went into the ministry, and God used those guys in a powerful way. Mom and dad went to the mission field. Mark's mom and dad went into the pastorate, ended up in Independence, Missouri for many years. And there was a guy by the name of Tom Bray, who was a pastor at Nolan Road Baptist Church in Independence. He gave me my first job in the ministry. And so, these guys, Bruce Thompson came back. He was a dean of men at William Jewell College, and David Head went on to pastor in New York. So these guys, God used these guys and built a foundation in their lives of ministry. And that became kind of the format. That's where we discovered what ministry was all about. Mark learned it at his dad's feet. I learned it at my dad's feet, and it became that understanding. Okay, God, this is where you're leading me. I know you're leading me in this direction. I'm not exactly sure how you're going to use me, but I sense that this is the direction that I'm going. And so when Mark and I became friends, that was already in place. Ministry was already there. So when Mark went on with NAM, North American Mission Board, and I was still in the ministry, in the pastorate, it was one of those things that we knew that somehow or other our lives would just be intertwined over in and out. It just kept happening over and over and over again. So when when this opportunity came up for the podcast, he was saying like, well, we got to do this. And so, okay. I mean, if you think we should. Well, he came here to the studio and we dummied up one of those programs, one of those podcasts, just the two of us. And it was just a sample, and it must have been good enough to get accepted because they went with it. So,
well, one of the things I love about it, and obviously, I mean, I'm getting to serve as the executive producer, and just getting to be kind of behind what you guys do. It really is. It's like listeners get to just come in and join in on this conversation that's happening about ministry and revitalization and stuff that's happening. So, as kind of the host, you get to throw out these questions to Mark Clifton and Mark Halleck. What's been your favorite part of that podcast so far?
Throwing them questions or comments that they don't expect. That's half the fun, because I think that makes for a good interview, to be honest with you. I think it's being able to, when I was in radio, I got to interview some huge names, Paul McCartney, Smokey Robinson, just on and on and on. And these guys they were so used to being interviewed that I wanted our interview to be memorable. And so I started learning to interview in a way that they didn't expect, asking them questions that they didn't expect, taking the conversation in a direction that they didn't expect. That makes it, I think, so much more interesting and honest and transparent. And I mean, there have been times on our podcast when I've asked a question and both Mark Clifton and Mark Hallett have said, I don't know, I don't know how to answer that. And I love that. I love that transparency that says we're in this together, we're learning. And, the truth of the matter is we're all three pastors. And we're vulnerable. We've got vulnerable personalities. We bleed like everybody else. We hurt like everybody else. We have our feelings hurt like everybody else. And we're ministering to people who are the same way. Yeah. They're the same people. They're the same people as we are. And so we're connecting on that level that says, we know what you're going through, and we're going to talk about things that are pertinent to you because we know that they're important because they're important to us, and we're vulnerable and focused on ministry just as you are and want to learn. And so I think that's part of it. And so Halleck and Clifton are always talking about things that they read, and those guys are avid students of the Word, and so they're always talking about the things that they've learned. And I think that makes for a great interview because they want to share. I mean, that's what that we're told, in Acts, we cannot but speak of the things that we have seen and heard. And so that's what we do. That's what we do in that podcast. We talk about the things that we have seen and that we've heard and that have made a difference in our life.
Yeah, that's good. And so if you've not already listened, please go to revitalizeandreplant.com. Check out that podcast. And it's on all the podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple, Google as well.
Please send your offerings. Send them.
Yes. And Dan, thank you so much for joining us today on Not Another Baptist Podcast. I have just a couple of rapid questions I want to ask you. So in all your years, what was your favorite interview that you did?
Paul McCartney.
Oh.
Yeah, I got to
hands down. Yeah,
yeah. It was Paul. We were the only media outlet that got to interview him, and they of TV, print, radio. We were the only one that was allowed to interview him, and they brought us to the green room, and at the stage it was at Arrowhead Stadium in Kansas City. And they said, you'll have 10 minutes with Mr. McCartney. Well, that 10 minutes turned into 45 minutes.
Wow.
And he was just he was so affable. He was so kind. He just so easy to talk to. But true to what I've said before, I took him in directions that he wasn't expecting. And he had just come out with an album, one of his Wings albums, and his son had played on it. So I asked him how that was. How was it? His son is a musician. He talked about it, and I said, "But how do you feel about his music?" And he said, "Oh, he's a good musician." I said, "No. How do you feel about his music, the music he likes?" And he said, "Oh, I hate it." And he said, sometimes I go to the bottom of the steps and I just yell up at him to turn that stuff off. And I got so tickled because that's what happened to us as kids. We'd be listening to the Beatles and our parents would be yelling at us to turn that stuff off. And here he was yelling the same thing at his kid. It was great. And
then baseball. What was your favorite baseball moment that you got to see from the announcer's booth?
We talk about this on, I don't know. I think we talk about this. Yeah, we did. Well, I don't remember if we talked about this or not. But when the St. Louis Cardinals, they played in the World Series in '85, and the Royals won, and the Cardinals believed that it was because there was a bad call by the umpire named Don Dinkinger. And it didn't. I don't think it had any outcome on the game itself, but they choose to believe that, which is okay. And a few years later, we had intra-league play, and so the Cardinals were in town to play the Royals again. Place was packed. I mean, 40,000 people. I don't know how many people were there, but it was totally packed out. And what you do is you introduce the players and all of that stuff, and then before the game actually starts, you introduce the umpires. You said behind home plate, so and so, first base, second base, third base, yada yada yada. And I introduced all of the umpires, and then at the end I said, and unfortunately, Don Dinkinger couldn't be with us today. And the stadium erupted. It just erupted. And boy, just a few minutes later, the president of the Royals came busting into my booth and he says, "Is that in your script?" And I said, "Well, no, that's not in your script." "Well, then why'd you say it?" Because it felt like the right thing to say. Oh, man. So, yeah, that was one of the more fun things.
Oh, man, that's great. Well, folks, as I said, Dan is, I believe, the most interesting Baptist in the world. And so be sure to check out Revitalize and Replant. And then, Dan, I sent you our sign-off.
Yeah.
And for the last 5-6 years or so, we've used this, but never. I just want to hear it in your voice as we sign off. So, y'all, thanks for listening today. And Dan is going to sign us off.
May your coffee be as black as night and as bold as the gospel you declare.
We hope you enjoyed that episode, but as a Christ follower, you are called to obey the Great Commandment, and you are called to pursue the Great Commission. Southwestern Seminary will encourage you to love God with all you are and will equip you to serve God wherever He calls. Whether you're just beginning your journey or have decades of experience, Southwestern Seminary will equip you to live your calling. This seminary is grace-filled, Christ-centered, scripturally grounded, confessionally guided, student-focused, and globally engaged. Learn more about Southwestern Seminary's core values at swbts.edu/core values.
What's wrong with you people?